Hi everyone. Today I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Travis Idle and Dr. J.B. Friday. Dr. Travis Idle and J.B. Friday are here to share about their work on the restoration and sustainable harvesting of native Hawaiian tree species like koa and sandalwood. Both are professors of forestry in the Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Management at UH. They're also both involved in the Hawaii Forest Institute. Dr. Idle serves as the organization's president and Dr. Friday serves as director. Dr. Idle's research focuses on nutrient cycling, fine root dynamics, productivity management and modeling of acacia koa forests, dry forests, and agroforestry systems. He holds a BS in biology, an MS in forest soils, and a PhD in forest nutrient cycling. Dr. Friday specializes in agroforestry and manages the Renewable Resources Extension Act program in Hawaii. His research projects include silviculture and management of acacia koa forestry, conservation nurseries for the Pacific Islands, and ecology and management of rapid ohia depth. He holds a BA in biology, a master of forestry, and a PhD in agronomy and soil science. Thank you both for being here, and I look forward to hearing your expertise.
Great. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for people that are also online. You all don't see me around much because I don't live here. I live in Hilo. And the reason I live in Hilo, is there a microphone or just picking up?
It picks you up from the middle of the room.
Okay.
And then we're not sharing screen yet, just so you know, as long as you.
Fine. Okay, so I'll just let you know when we're going to start with slides then. But that's, if I wander past the podium, I'm not off mic.
Correct. You're not off mic and you're not off camera because it picks you up from the center there, essentially.
All right. So we at CTAR are land grant college. What does that mean? We're the land grant college. None of you went to undergrad or land grant school. None of you went to a land grant school. Nobody went to like Ohio State, Cal State Fullerton, Humboldt. No, okay. So education got started in the US as schools for lawyers and ministers and politicians. I saw the classic liberal arts, you studied rhetoric and Greek and Latin and Hebrew. 1800s, technology started becoming important. The educational system needed to education in things like farming, and that would educate people to improve the economy. And there's a big change. So UH Manoa started with what? What was the first part of UH Manoa? College of Agriculture and Mechanical Arts. UH Manoa was started for manufacturing and agriculture. So there's three missions to the land grant school. First mission is teaching students, which is what we're doing here today. Second mission is doing research, which is what we're talking about some. The third part, and the third leg of the stool, is bringing the research results to people who are going to use it. So working with stakeholders to teach them stuff that they can use. And for us at CTAR, it's like Travis and my stakeholders are people managing forests. But CTAR is also people that feed their families with a nutrition program, raise livestock in the livestock program, and do 4-H with the kids. So I'm extension, most of my job is extension. Most of my programs are teaching landowners about how to manage forests, whether it's rapid ohia depth, or doing agroforestry, or doing koa and sandalwood silviculture. And because most of the forests are on the Big Island, that's where I am, and most of my work has been on the Big Island, although I've had work across, and then also across the Pacific. Okay, getting into our topic today, can we go to the slides now? Are we in slides now?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Hold on, sorry, it's not sharing yet.
You're not sharing, but you see this. Reforestation on private lands, and this is something we want to focus on today, on how this is not just conservation, but private landowners reforesting with things in a way that is restoration of native ecosystems, which you all like, but it's also doing maybe in a way to make money. If you can squint and see the values of those sandalwood bottles, this was at Mary Monarch. Do you guys know what Mary Monarch is? I come to Oahu and I don't know how much. How many have been in Hawaii for at least 5 years? Almost everybody. Okay, so you know what Mary Monarch is. Look at Mary Monarch. Can you see what the prices are of this? The 5 mil sandalwood for $85. 10 mil of sandalwood oil for $160. Very high value products there. So sandalwood and koa. So I'm going to talk about koa, and then Travis is mostly going to talk about the sandalwood side of what we do. Koa is our largest common native tree. It is, the emergent of a canopy. It can be very straight logs, and this is a Kapapala canoe. You very rarely see tall straight koa, but koa, it's just awkward because I want to look at the students, but they're here. I'll walk around there. These are logs that someday will become koa canoes. If you've ever been to Hilo Bay and watched the koa canoes racing, you don't see that much anymore. Beautiful wood, it's a legume, it's nitrogen fixating, it's your typical Mimosoides flowers there. This is, you see the grain on the wood of that. Koa could be really big. And this is something this is one that treated in Hawaii Volcanoes National Park. Travis recognizes the young lad in that who is no longer a young lad. This is an old picture because what happened to this koa is it fell over. It got all hollow, rotten on the inside, and fell over. And that was the end of this koa. However, it is still the basis for today's local produced wood industry, the koa furniture and stuff like that. And what they're doing is they're harvesting old growth koa. In fact, Jay here, he's harvesting, this is up Waipunalei, which is above the Hilo Hamakua coast on the Big Island. He's harvesting dead logs. The trees are down on the ground, this is park ranch land, taking them out and milling them. And so this old growth koa, these old senescent trees, is still what the woodworkers that are doing the very expensive wood that none of us in the room can afford, furniture, are using for their things. And most of that forest is gone though, because what? Why don't we have a little koa forest? Here's the clue. Ranching. When koa was harvested, the land managers brought cattle in, and cattle love to eat koa seedlings. So they bring the cattle in, and this here, so you see a few remaining dead koas that have been there for many decades, but every little koa seedling has been eaten by the cattle in there. So we've turned a lot of our koa forest into ranches. Ranching is declining. Ranching in the past 20 years has dropped by about half as these marginal lands are no longer becoming economically efficient to ranch. This is opportunities for restoring koa forests. This was one of the loggers, Dave, that I showed you there. He wanted to see some things grow. He put logs around to make a fence that the cattle couldn't get at it. And this is like a year-old seedling with me standing behind it that the cattle didn't eat. But the ones outside, you see the cattle would come through and nip them all off on that. So the koa forest is also threatened by invasive species. This was, this again was a huge forest koa. That a couple of years after that, again, it split in half. It was old, it was full of rock on the inside and just the weight. But what happened with that is all these other trees around is a plantation species called tropical ash. It's a true fraxinus because you know ash in the mainland, but it's a Mexican species. And they planted it back in the conservation days, a potential timber because it was invisible, but it spreads and it spreads in the koa forest. And what we found, this is up above Laupahoehoe, and what we found in a study there was that the ash regenerated at like 4 times the rate of the koa. So here's a koa seedling, and all these other little seedlings around are tropical ash. That's the Manipoca. So invasive species taking over the koa forest is another threat to the koa forest. And we studied 30 years after logging what was coming up there, and the amount of ash just exploded as the logging opened up gaps. The ash was able to exploit it because if any of you know what ash seeds look like, they're the wing seed that blow everywhere. Ash has seeds with little wings on them, and they blow everywhere. And so it goes everywhere, and it basically outcompeted the koa in the area. And that was a paper we did on that. Lower down, it gets outcompeted by strawberry guava. So we have a lot of forest that is native in the overstory, but non-native in the understory. There was a paper published a couple of years ago, like 2 or 3 years ago, that showed that about 1/3 of what looks like native forest from above is like this. It's all strawberry guava understory. So to a forester, we look at this and go, this is like an old folks home with no young people. It's not a healthy community. When these old trees die, it's just going to be strawberry guava because the understory isn't regenerating it. Another threat we have for the koa forest is wildfires. Koa is very sensitive to burning. And we were just talking about this. So this wasn't a crown fire. This was Mauna Loa Strip Road. So on Hawaii Volcanoes National Park, and there's the road that goes up Mauna Loa. A fire came through from the neighboring ranch. The understory grasses carried it, and the koa was all girdled by the fire. So it didn't crown, it didn't go through the tops of the koa, but it girdled and killed all the koa. And it was hundreds of acres of basically pure koa that had come up after ranching. That area had been fenced in the 70s, and they pulled the goats and cattle out, and the koa all came back. Because the koa comes back from buried seed, so when the koa has seed, it drops it. It's a legume, so it's these shiny, long-lived seeds in the soil. So the koa came back after that, but then this fire came through and killed it. But this was, I'm gonna say, 6 months after the fire, I took this photo. All these are koa seedlings. So the koa came back, thousands and thousands of seedlings. This is a mature tree that burned, but the koa had been dropping seed into the soil since the 70s. So there's so much seed in the soil. When the fire came through and burnt out the grass, all the seedlings came up. So that area now is 9 years after the fire. The whole thing is thickets of koa, apali, and bracken fern. If you know bracken fern, if that's the other native that came up at a landscape scale on that. So wildfires remain a big issue on koa forests. We use the word resilient a lot, so I'm going to define resilient the way ecologists define it. Resilient means, can you come back after a disturbance? A disturbance in ecologists means it's a some sort of catastrophic thing that happens to the ecosystem. A windstorm, a fire, a harvest, a landslide, whatever. So after a disturbance, can the ecosystem rebound? Can it come back? We think of a grassland as resilient because a fire comes to a grassland, the grass grows back pretty quickly. Forest less so because trees take a long time to grow back. So how resilient is something? The forest can be resilient, and this is an example of Travis and I worked. I think pretty much when Travis was first here, we got going on this. This is Kehoe Ranch, which is Kamehameha School's property adjacent to Hawaii Volcanoes National Park up there. This was an area that, and this wasn't my picture because I was not here in 1977. I was in high school. This was your typical upland forest with cows roaming around, eating stuff. More and more grass every year, fewer and fewer trees, but still a fair diversity of trees and old koa overstory. I think that's a Nile in front of it. So kind of mixed. Kamehameha Schools had an idea of maybe we can regenerate a koa forest because they'd already logged out the worthwhile logs up there, and they're just running cattle and gradually turning it into pasture. But some people in Kamehameha Schools had a vision we could restore koa forest here. Other people said they were crazy because ranching pays you money, and they didn't think growing trees could ever pay you money. But what they did is they went through, they clear cut the whole thing, everything that, and then dozed it. So 77, the whole thing was flat dozed. 3 years later, the whole thing was a carpet of koa seedlings. They knew that there were the seeds buried in the seed bank, and the koa seedlings all shot up after they ran the bulldozer over and chewed up the grass and stuff like that. It came up. So this is like what I was just saying with the Mauna. This is what would have been like on that Mauna Loa burn fire about 2 years after that. It would have shot up. So it shot up like this, and then by 2007, it was a koa overstory with native. Wait, I just finished talking about fire. Okay. The koa overstory with all kinds of natives understory because it was next to nice adjacent forest. So it had Naya, Ohia, Akala, Olapa, all the native trees seeding in at the understory. Now, Kamehameha Schools wanted to know, well, can we manage this to get some timber out of it? We want to manage this in a sustainable forestry project. So we did a project where we did, in forestry jargon, a crop tree selection thinning. So what that is if you look out and you see what trees look like they have formed to be a good lumber tree to be harvested, could you make those grow faster by getting rid of their competition, basically? Koa, the silvex of koa is because it comes up, you see how it came up in the field. It's tall, so it shoots up above everything. It's a light demanding species. If another tree gets over top of it, it stops. It doesn't grow in the shade, it only grows in the light. So if you have two trees fighting it out, only one's gonna win, the other's gonna live. So if you pick what it is, you can improve, theoretically, you can improve the growth. Now, what I heard from the old timers, it doesn't work. And that didn't make sense because it really should work. So we did a study where so this was the tree we picked, nice diameter growth, pretty straight. And then all the trees that the crowns touched of it, we got rid of. We did double girdle. So here we can see we covered it twice with the chainsaw ring. And we also fertilized some with phosphorus, and we controlled the grass with herbicides in a completely replicated sort of design in that. And what we found in that is that by treating it that way, we doubled the diameter growth. So if Kamehameha Schools wanted to manage that to produce timber to offset some of their costs, they could do the sort of management for it. And we had field days out there. We had the Kamehameha Schools people out there. And Paul Scowcroft was with the U.S. Forest Service, and we worked with him a lot on some of this silviculture. Paul was 30 years ahead of me, I think, in doing stuff like that. So crop tree selection thinning. Then we went over to a younger ranch, and there you see some younger foresters than we're in this picture too. But we went over to a younger ranch and did this in a 7-year-old stand. So this again was an area where they had harvested the remaining koa trees and they just bulldozed it. They put a fence to keep the cows out, and it just came up really thick. Said, well, at this point, could we thin out, keep the better ones, and the landowner could see a return sooner? Because again, forestry, your return is a long time. If you could hurry that up, you guys have all had your basic economics, that time cost of money is really important. And forestry, when you're talking 40, 50, 60 years out, it's really important if you can bring that back in a little closer. Can we do that? So we showed here, so here you can see how many trees. The three of us cut, we cut 700 trees in 4 days in that thing? So this was little things, we just chopped them all down, opened up, and see that's a crop tree in the middle that Dean's lying against. And again, we showed we really increased the diameter growth of it. And also because we picked the straighter ones, we increased how long the log is, if you're thinking about doing that.
What is a bowl?
A bowl is the trunk of the tree. The trunk.
Okay, so what does it mean, increase the clear bowl?
Oh, clear bowl, sorry, forestry degree. No branches. How long is your log, right? If you're growing as a project, and again, because koa is a legume, what's the most common legume tree you see when you walk out the door? What?
Yes, true.
Okay, it's koa howling. Okay, that's good. I was thinking monkey pine. So spruce trees and eucalyptus like to grow tall. Pine and eucalyptus and spruce try to grow straight. Legumes grow big, wide, and branchy. So basically, before it starts branching, that's your harvestable unit. Once it starts branching, you're not talking much here. So if you can make the harvestable unit 40% longer, that really helps. So when we select trees, what we do is we go out and we look. Among other things, this one's straight, this one goes up a long way before it branches, this one branches way down here. If it branches way down here, we girdle it to get rid of it, because the one that was straighter. So you selectively go for that. And again, the idea was, again, we're trying to show the landowners ways they can manage their forests to make them productive, because these are private landowners. They want the lands to be productive or something. We, because we're foresters, want them to give an alternative to ranching and growing koa trees. One of the other projects that we're doing is developing seed orchards for reforesting of other areas. Now, the areas that I showed you recently had koa or were adjacent to areas that had a lot of koa that grow back naturally. So none of those trees I showed you before were planted, but we also have a lot of areas that no koa is going to grow. You're going to have to plant. So for these, we want to plant. And this is a particular project up for Department of Land and Homelands. Department of Land and Homelands manages a parcel of 45,000 acres on Mauna Kea. And it's cold, and actually it freezes sometimes in the winter. Hakalau said they had 29 degrees the other day at Hakalau. So it freezes sometimes in the winter. So some koa that have naturally grown at that altitude are more adapted to the cold than others. So what we're doing is we're growing seed orchards there for these koa trees. And the idea is that we'll be selectively growing ones that are tolerant to the cold for that. This is a 19-year-old seed orchard that I didn't plant. This was a 7-year-old seed orchard that we did plant, and so the design for that was we got seed from 20 different families across Mauka, Mauna Kea, and then put it out in a replicated design. And then after 10 years, we evaluated their growth. We cut out half of them last year. We're going to cut out half of the remaining ones and keep the top 25%, balancing with diversity. And then we have a whole spreadsheet. You economists would like that. So it's a spreadsheet decision support. So you can weigh your different factors, straightness, clear bowl, growth rate, all that, and weight them and decide which trees you keep and which ones you don't from that. And this is last week at that thing. I like this picture because you're going to work forestry in Hawaii. You must just be in surf shorts and slippers all day long. No, it was teeming down rain and probably about 62 degrees up there that day. This is at 6,800 feet. But here's the seed orchard as we see it now. And next thing is to cut out again half of these trees. And you see some of them are really taking off. And so we have to do that decision on that. So seed orchard to produce trees that are adapted to that environment. And this is specifically working with Department of Land and Homelands, trying to make their former pasture land some sort of productive use. Okay, no. Oh, you set that. That's actually working.
It's working now.
That's working now. Okay, okay. However, plantation koa hasn't been great. Now, It all depends what you're growing trees for. If you want bird habitat, this is great. This is lots of dead wood, so you get a lot of insects, so you get the rare birds like the Akia polao and the insectivorous. It's good lapio habitat, it's good Akia polao habitat here. That's all great. David there, he wanted it to be timber, and he's getting 5 foot, so here's your clear bowl, right? This has got like a 5 foot clear bowl on this. That's pretty useless for timber. So we have to figure out what to do about that. Is it genetics? Some of it is. So this stand here that I showed you earlier, this is just extraordinary genetics. And Forestry and Wildlife, now this is public land. Forestry and Wildlife, actually it was leased to a ranch, but they took it back. They're managing this now as a community forest for producing canoe logs there, because this is one place where it really is like canoe logs. But here's a tree just out in the open where you'd expect it to be branchy, and it grew beautifully straight. So, okay, some of it is genetics, and that's why we're trying to select for straight ones when we do the plantations. Conventional wisdom is that why they're spaced out too wide, is they get too, this tree was
12 foot spacing?
No, this is the one that the neighbors were dead, so it got to be a wolf tree, but it's still only about 20 years old.
Yeah.
So it does grow pretty fast, but most of it was sapwood, and it's useless, as you can see, for sawmill, it's pretty much useless there. But it turns out one of the main things that's happening on this is there's an insect that attacks the leader of the koa, and it forces it to branch out. It forces it to branch out, and then since it's a legume, once you kill the leader, it just makes a lot of branches. It turns into a candelabra. So you see it kills this, and then it goes, and so this is one that the leader got killed a couple of years ago, and now it's got 3 stems, and it will never have a proper log on this thing. So working for management is pruning and singling in the plantations, so putting it in, going back to, it's got multiple stems, prune it back to a single stem, that's singling, and then pruning off the side branches, trying to try to get trees that are like this, that someday are going to be a log that you can put on the sawmill. So some of this work we did 20-something years ago, but the environment, the economic environment changed, cultural environment changed. This has been a really big change, and to me really encouraging that these private ranchers are putting in hundreds of acres of koa and sandalwood every year now, with the idea of being able to develop sustainable forestry practices, but at the same time, you're creating native habitat for your native birds, your native insects, you're sequestering carbon, you're doing all these other good environmental things by putting trees on the ground. So this is Kealakoko Mountain Reserve about 4 years ago, and if you were standing there today, you would not see anything because the trees would be blocking all your view. Paniolo Tone Woods is owned by Taylor Guitars. So you know Taylor Swift plays a koa guitar? Bob Taylor of Taylor Guitars wants his company to be sustainable. So he bought 500 acres in a Holoa and is planting koa trees so that in the future, he will still be able to make his company, long after he's dead, long after we're all dead, is going to be able to make koa guitars. So they're investing in doing that. And so the foresters on these projects are working with us. How can we continuously improve growing our koa? And it does grow pretty fast. So this is a 6-year-old koa at, you guys aren't impressed how fast this is. How tall is a 6-year-old oak tree in Massachusetts? Who's from Massachusetts? Anybody from Massachusetts? How tall is a 6-year-old oak tree in Massachusetts?
Very little.
It's like that tall. This is growing fast. People say, oh, koa doesn't grow that fast. Well, okay, compared to how busy, it doesn't grow that fast, but it still grows pretty fast. I mean, for a 6-year-old koa, that's pretty fast. And then this is a sandalwood underneath it, which is only like about 4 years. It does grow pretty fast. One of the other questions is, though, what is the value of a wood of a fast-grown tree versus a slow-grown tree, the old growth? Because the current market is on old growth. So we did a study here where we harvested wood from 3 different sites that they were planted, so we knew how old they were. Actually, no, sorry. We knew how old they were. They either came up by themselves after a disturbance or they were planted. And we harvested them. We looked at how much wood we got out of them. In any of these crooked trees, how much wood? How much was sapwood? Because this is really important. See, look how much sapwood and heartwood is on this? Is the sapwood marketable? That's the question. That's one of the many questions. What we did was then contracted woodworkers to build things out of them. Bowl turners, woodworkers. That's a bowl turner there, and even at the university did that. So and give us their opinion of it. so we had woodworkers turning the bowls, this is Don Albrecht, turning bowls from it, and this is really interesting. Now, Scott Hare is a really outstanding bowl turner, and what he does is he turns, he's a meke, and he carves, I don't know if you can see it, he carves, this is a, what's that? Might even be an oval on a coal, and it's just beautiful carving. So his opinion was, here's the stuff made out of the 25-year-old wood on this. It makes a perfectly nice straight umeke, but he can't carve it because it's too light, it's too soft. He says, it's not for me, but it has value. So we kept getting that. You know, people, here's the different furniture people did. This is the UH class did these, and this is the little thing you put by your back door, so you sit down, you take your shoes off, you put it in the cabinet, and breathe. There's a Japanese word for it, but it's the little bench. The bench, maybe the bench by your back door where you sit and you take your shoes off. That was their project, and the students got COA to work with. There's value to it, but it's not the current day's market. So this was some of the woodworkers' opinions on this. And so that's partly where we are now. All these trees being planted, what is the value of them? It's not going to be the same as the old growth stuff, but it does have a value. And I guess we just have to get it on the market to see what people are willing to pay for it. So that will be really interesting. We did a consumer preference study with trade-offs among figure, color, and price. And price was the dominant, people picked the cheapest thing. But there were some, what we thought was the more figure, the better, the darker, the better, because you talk about that. It turns out that consumers were all over the board. Some preferred lighter colors, some preferred, so we had these bowls all made, and people did preference which they liked about it. Kathy Chan was leading up that. And what did they like? So there are markets for all the different woods. So we're doing lots of projects on managing co-forests, replanting co-forests, and then thinking ahead to also what products are going to be out of them, with the idea that, again, if landowners have economic incentives of doing this, then all the other environmental stuff comes along with it. So that's it for the COA, and you're on to the Sandalwood part. Thanks.
So, yeah, I'm going to talk about Sandalwood, and it's kind of really a segue from COA to Sandalwood, which we'll talk about in why that's the case. But leading into this, of course, you know, JB's talking about, we've been working on this for 20 plus years. Paul Scowcroft, one of our early mentors, had been working on it for a couple of decades before. So we had a lot of knowledge kind of up until the 2010s or so on COA. We had almost nothing on regeneration, restoration, silviculture of Iliaki, which is the Hawaiian word for our endemic species of sandalwood. As JB shown up here, there are several species that are all endemic. So out of the maybe 20 species of santalum all around the world, we have 6 of them right here in the islands. We are a center of biodiversity for this species, even though we may not be known about it as much here in the modern era. Santalum paniculatum is one of the species found only on Hawaii Island. There are some, like ellipticum, that are found on multiple islands. It's found in dry and moist forests on the slopes of Hawaii Island. There are some large remnant populations, but most of these trees at some point have been cut for agriculture. What makes santalum or sandalwood unique or distinct? They are what's called hemiparasitic. How many folks are familiar with mistletoe? How does mistletoe grow? Where does it grow? It grows on a tree branch. It actually parasitizes trees or woody plants, attaches its roots inside the stem, and then it pulls resources out of the plant that is its host, and that's what it lives on. Sandalwood can live like a normal plant. It has roots, it has shoots, it has leaves, it can photosynthesize, its roots can take up water and nutrients, but its roots can also parasitize the root of another plant. And so it's called hemiparasitism because it's not an obligate parasite, but it can definitely benefit from that. And in particular, so I put this up here because they kind of look like a regular tree, but they function in some ways like a mistletoe. And actually, this is a paper that JB was co-author on with one of our plant pathologists, Scott Nelson. So the history of sandalwood, when the Europeans came to the islands, they quickly realized we had sandalwood. They were very familiar with Indian or Asian sandalwood, Santalum album, and the really high value price that it got in Asian markets. And so there was a real interest in exporting Hawaiian sandalwood, Iliahi, for that market. So it was actually one of the first commercial export crops that the Europeans marketed in the islands. Well, why was that allowed to happen? Well, partly the story is that the Hawaiian royalty were buying a lot of the new technology, new products and things that the Europeans were bringing, and they were racking up debts that they couldn't pay. And sandalwood was the one thing, the highest valued product that they could basically trade or sell to the Europeans to pay off those debts. So that's kind of the story that's often told. And so the kind of the sad social part of this story is that the ali'i, the royalty that owned the lands and was indebted, would conscript the local folks who were mostly just trying to make a living down below into going up the mountain, harvesting sandalwood, bring it down the mountain to pay off the debts to the English traders. And so these people were being taken away from their normal livelihoods to harvest sandalwood. So they essentially were becoming, they were suffering because of the loss of the sandalwood, because they were being taken away from the everyday lives and things they needed to do. So there's lots of other stories potentially of them actually pulling sandalwood seedlings out of the ground to keep it from regenerating, not so much for their own benefit, but because they didn't want their children to have to do the same things they were having to do. So it's a really, it's a touchy issue sometimes, even now with Native Hawaiians and sandalwood. So the Iliahi or the sandalwood, most of the value of the sandalwood, of course, is the oils, the essential oils that are used in all kinds of products, perfumes, cosmetics, botanicals, medicinals. A lot of that is in the roots and the stump. That's where it tends to concentrate in old trees. So the harvesting that they do today, often they will actually dig up the tree out of the ground itself to get access to that material. So that's really destructive kind of harvesting rather than just sort of cutting the tree down. But actually what we find, anecdotally, is that when you dig up that stump and break it up, the roots that remain in the soil around that tree will actually resprout. And you'll get a lot of regeneration potentially right around the tree you just harvested. They're all clones of each other, but you can get reasonable natural regeneration after harvesting. There are a few places on Hawaii Island where there is enough remnant Iliahi, Santalum paniculatum, to be commercially harvested. And some of these are on private lands. So there is some harvesting that started back about 15 years ago and continues today. And in these ranches, they actually process and steam distill and extract the oils right there on the property. So they're not selling wood, they're selling oil directly. And so this mason jar of oil here in the bottom right may go for somewhere a couple $1,000 for a liter or a mason jar of oil. So this is, again, a very high value product, as JB showed earlier. But they're using the income from this harvesting not to enrich themselves, but rather to reinvest in the land, to plant sandalwood and other native host species that they can then parasitize to help them establish. They're planting hundreds of acres a year, right? So they're taking that money and trying to restore the land back to sandalwood and other natives for conservation and for economic reasons. So one of the things they have to do is they've got to be able to generate enough seedlings, because most of this land, sandalwood does not come back naturally like koa might from a seed bank. It has to be planted. So one of the early kind of areas of research and development was on nursery production. We need to make sure we've got lots of quality seedlings to plant. We also need to figure out if we're going to plant a hemiparasite, it wants a host to parasitize. That's really important when it's a seedling because it doesn't have a lot of roots. It's not very large. So being able to connect to a host early on is really important for its success. So what species do we plant? How far away do we plant them? When do we plant them? There's all these kinds of just practical but important questions we have to ask. So one of the early sets of trials on both nursery production and on early planting establishment was done by an employee of the Holo'aina Ranch who just happened to be really smart and thought like a scientist. He was doing all kinds of trials. So fortunately, we were able to convince him, Ton Speechens, to become a graduate student so that he could do this in a more structured setting and actually be able to generate a thesis and get this information out there. So some of the early work was started on one of the private ranches by one of their professionals. We got him into, he actually went to Purdue University, which is one of our partners on this work, and he's supported by the Sloan Indigenous Graduates Partnership. He's a Sloan Fellow. So I bring this up just because any of you all, or if you know undergraduate students who are really interested in this kind of work, the Sloan Fellowship is for, of course, Native Americans, but also Native Hawaiians and Native Alaskans as well. I'm not sure if other Pacific Islanders would qualify, but definitely U.S. citizens who are Native American, Native Hawaiian, Native Alaskan are all eligible for the Sloan Fellowship. So Ton is a PhD student there now, but he continues to work, of course, here in Hawaii. Another ranch nearby where similar kinds of work has started is called Kealakekua Mountain Reserve. It is actually owned by an essential oils company called doTERRA. Does anyone know who doTERRA is? I have to admit, I didn't know who they were until I visited Kingdom. But
Never heard it.
they have a bunkhouse up here where you can stay overnight, and they have some of the most wonderful shampoos and hand soaps and all kinds of things in a bunkhouse. It's nicer than anything I have in my house because it's all doTERRA. Anyway. So we recruited a PhD student who actually had worked with our collaborator Doug Jacobs at Purdue, Emily Senegal-Thyroff, as a PhD student to work on similar kinds of things at KMR. So she was working on some of the nursery work. She worked in one of her field projects was a planting of sandalwood and two different host species, koa, which is a common one, as well as a'ali, and different spaces. So we're looking at species identity, spacing, and seeing how the two different species respond to each other. Hopefully the sandalwood or the iliaki would attach to its host relatively early on to help it survive, but not parasitize the host so much that it would kill it, right? So we had those kinds of trials going on, and then Emily and Ton worked together with others to take some of the improved nursery practices, propagation practices that they were developing and put together a publication on this. So getting some of this information out to not only the scientific community, but the practitioner community. So just recently, a few years ago, and this is from JB, that iliaki is now the fourth most commonly produced tree seedling in Hawaii. So there is definitely an increased interest in establishing and using iliaki not only for restoration, conservation purposes, but also as a potential economic product. So this is actually show you some results, some data, not just pretty pictures. So this is the effect of host species and planting distance on the growth of iliaki survival, survival at the top and diameter growth, stem diameter growth on the bottom. So what you can see is there's a lot of variability. There doesn't seem to be really strong, clear trends necessarily. There are some significant differences here, but survival essentially ranged from about 75, 80% to 50%, depending upon the treatment. Diameter growth tended to be generally better when paired with koa, which kind of makes sense. Koa is a nitrogen fixer, so it can supply that nutrient. It's also tend to be faster growing than iliaki, so it probably has a larger root network. And so iliaki can benefit from that. Plus, in Santalum album plantations through Asia, usually a nitrogen fixer, the recommendation is to plant it with a nitrogen fixer as a host. So we saw variation, but we kind of got the sort of results we were interested in. But what we saw was all different kinds of combinations of growth and survival. So what you see here on the left, this is iliaki, this is koa. This is iliaki, this is koa. This is iliaki, this is koa. Whole range of conditions, outcomes, and they're planted pretty close to each other, right, within 1 or 2 meters. So, there's a lot of range of variability in the actual outcomes, which kind of explains a little bit of the variation probably that we're seeing here. One of the other things, though, that Emily took advantage of was something that JB was involved in back in the early, in about 2010, 2011, and that was they planted koa in just basically a plantation setting on Kealakekua Mountain Reserve. And Emily said, well, we've got a nice stand of established koa. Maybe I can plant iliahi in the understory. And one of the reasons this was a good idea, because some of the koa actually died early on. It was a really bad dry spell, so some of the koa in the plantation died. So you had all these little gaps and openings in this plantation. So you had very different kind of understory environments for iliahi. So Emily planted on iliahi on a grid pattern and said, well, how will it do? You've got a nice root network, nice big host trees, but very highly variable kind of overstory conditions. And as you can see from here, if you plant it right on the edge of the plantation where it gets lots of light, it'll grow really fast. This sapling here is probably 4 or 5 years old. And even by then, some of these are flowering and fruiting. So we were getting seed production on iliahi and when it was like 5 years old. So some of these can do really well. What she found, though, in general, was almost every seedling she planted, 324 of them, survived. The growth was obviously positively related to how open the canopy was, but it was also negatively related to how far away it was from host trees. So there's kind of this trade-off between the canopy openness, but also distance to the nearest host. What we thought about as she was finishing up, we were thinking, in these two experiments, especially in what we call the host suitability site, where all the seedlings were planted at the same time, by the time they were 5 years old, they were interacting with each other. It wasn't just iliahi koa here, iliahi a'ali'i there. They were probably all interacting together because the root networks were getting larger, and so there was no independence of individual experimental units anymore. So we decided to do another set of studies with a new graduate student to look at this at the community level, the plot level, or a level the size of this room, if not larger, what we might call a forest stand, and say, let's look at these as a group, not just individually, and see how the results are holding up. So one of the things we wanted to look at was in the underplanting site, how much basal area, if we've got lots of large koa trees in a plot, how does that affect the growth of the koa and also the growth of iliahi, the sandalwood? Because normally you think the more competition there is, the slower the individuals in that stand are going to grow because there's only so much resources for everyone to share or everyone to capture. And as we expected for koa, there's a nice negative relationship between the basal area, or what we call the competition level, and the growth, the average growth, diameter growth of the trees. But for iliahi, because it's a root hemiparasite, we actually saw something very different. There's kind of this optimal or asymptotic relationship between basal area or competition and the growth of the iliahi. So they seem to be benefiting at the community level to having more basal area up to a certain point. So interesting kind of a contrast between the koa, which this is pretty classic for all kinds of forest species, and iliahi. So the other thing we calculated were a couple of measures of the species interactions, the iliahi and the koa, or the iliahi and the host interactions. The first is called facilitation, that's FL, and that's this line here. And what this is showing is as we have a greater proportion of all of the stems in the plot are a host, the iliahi tends to do better. So the more host it has, obviously, the better the iliahi does. Conversely, the lower the proportion of the host, the greater what we call the parasitism. In other words, the parasitism is the decline in the host growth because of the presence of iliahi. So here, the parasitism level actually tends to decline as the host proportion goes up because there were fewer iliahi pulling resources away from the host. So we were looking at where those two interactions might cross, because the objective of the landowner is it definitely wants the iliahi and the host species to all do well, but it wants to have as much iliahi in that stand as it can support, because that's the primary economic species. So finding the intersection of these two interactions can help us decide about what sort of ratio of host to iliahi you might want to plant. In this case, it's about 2/3 host to iliahi, which is a ratio of about 2 to 1, which matches up pretty reasonably well with what, again, Santalum album plantation work would suggest. So we have these two studies, and one of the questions is, well, what's important? Is it making sure you have the right ratio? Is it the spacing? Is it the timing of when the host goes in? Because it generally helps to have the host first. So Pandu did what's called a structural equation modeling approach to look at the primary factors that might affect the growth of Iliahi. So IG is the growth, the planting time, the planting mixture, right, Iliahi to host, or in this case, what is the fraction of the host that is COA, or a nitrogen fixer? Because that's generally the type of species that's recommended. And what he found was that the planting time was probably the most important factor. It has a direct effect on Iliahi growth. The planting mixture affects that facilitation parasitism interaction, so it has an effect indirectly, and that the fraction of hosts that are nitrogen fixers didn't seem to have that big of an effect. So we had COA and Iliahi, or sorry, A'ali'i in that host suitability study, and what this kind of comparison of those two studies suggests is that as long as you've got enough hosts to support Iliahi, then you can get pretty good results from Iliahi growth. Not all of them have to be COA. Okay, so wrap up quickly with recommendations. This is the kind of thing maybe if you plant COA 2 or 3 years before Iliahi, this might be a good kind of compromise in making sure that you have reasonable growth of both the host and the Iliahi. And there's some other things that we're beginning to look at, such as thinning, which you only have 1 year of results, so I'll skip over that real quick. But the next thing we want to do is we actually want to try to look at the below ground dynamics, the roots and the networks, and how that might affect, because we're doing a lot of inference above ground of what we think is happening below ground, so we'd like to look at that directly. So with that, I want to just briefly say there's lots of folks, of course, who've been involved in this research and this development and over the years, and we can't list them all, but we do want to say thank you to universities, to federal and state partners, to Hawaii Ag Research Centers, to the landowners, and also the Tropical Hardwood Tree Improvement and Regeneration Center, which is now this university and Forest Service supported collaboration to help bring all these folks together and continue some of this research. So, and I want to just give a personal thanks to JB for helping get me started 20-something years ago on some of this work. It's been a great journey, and I hope we can continue at least for a few more years. So, thanks very much.